What's up, everyone? Well, Dwarf Jade is not a common bonsai subject in serious bonsai circles, but why not? Today I'm going to look at some of the development steps that I took to get to here and then talk about what's sort of missing in most Dwarf Jade compositions. A little over 2 years ago, I trunk chopped this from something that was a lot taller into this roughly 10-inch composition with the major trunk chop being right in here, and it's sort of hiding behind some leaves right now. But the reason I did that, or my main reasoning, was that I wanted to have a tree that had a little bit more sort of taper in the trunk and interest. But in the end, and we're not really at the end, but I'm still not super happy with this because the trunk feels kind of static and uninteresting. So I'm not comparing Dwarf Jade to, say, like a juniper composition, but I do want the trunk to be a little bit more interesting than this if possible. So the old chop is kind of healed over, and I've been just sort of going through the regular development cycle of Dwarf Jade, which is basically allowing the shoots to run and then cutting them back to the first pair of leaves. That causes you to get more splits and essentially creates good amounts of branching that you can then come in and edit. So as I'm talking here, I am just cutting off a few leaves so that you can see some of the structure a little bit better. And whether or not I do this, the tree is going to continue to send out those shoots. And basically, it's a reasonably straightforward process to get good ramification on these guys. Now, they are cold sensitive, so if you live in a cold climate, you are going to have to keep these indoors during the winter. And in fact, I keep the majority of mine in a greenhouse, even though I live in San Francisco and my growing grounds generally doesn't get much below 40 degrees. We do get occasional freezes, but just that accumulated time in the cold out in the field can cause some damage to the leaves. Usually they'll come back, but occasionally I've seen the plants actually have trunk dieback as a result of those cold conditions. So if I set this aside and I look, this is essentially one that I've had in this 4-inch container for probably a year or two now. I don't actually know because I have quite a few of them. If you want to pick up some, you can get them on bonsaify.com. The general sort of growth habit is pretty straightforward. You see that like they just kind of make these forks and stuff. So this hasn't really been trimmed or anything. Maybe it had a little bit of dieback last winter. I actually had quite a few of them tank on me over last winter when we got some 27-degree temperatures out in the field. But basically, so it's creating a fork here. So I could reorient this, like say I want this to be my trunk, and I've got a little bit of movement here. And then I'm gonna, if I wanna cut this off to make it look more like a bonsai, I can kind of edit it down here to create more movement and something that's more in scale with the size of the trunk. And now I can go into the same process that I used on this. But what I see from my perspective with Dwarf Jade is that this is the common thing that people do, and they don't think about the actual development of the trunk the way we think about it in terms of so many other trees. So if you take a pine tree and you just did this same sort of thing, you're going to end up with a bonsai that looks kind of lanky and uninteresting compared to what we consider being good pine bonsai. So the same thing should be true for Dwarf Jade, but I think part of the problem here is that a lot of people don't actually understand what a Dwarf Jade looks like in nature. But we don't actually have to understand what a Dwarf Jade looks like in nature in order to make a good bonsai out of it. Let's take a look at another example that I've been working on for a little bit longer. So this is a tree that I have been growing in this gallon container for a couple of years now, and it's been cut back previously reasonably hard. You can see an old cut right here, and then I've allowed it to send out strong shoots again. So this one's probably 16 inches long, and there's another couple on here that are 12 to 16 inches long. But what I want to sort of point out is that not only is the trunk getting kind of bigger, it's also getting more interesting as I do more and more operations like this. So just like any other bonsai, I am concerned with every aspect of the plant. And so as I'm working on this, I'm gonna take a look at the root structure to make sure I'm creating good nebari, and then I'm gonna revisit all of the decisions that I've made so far in terms of the trunk. So I've just basically done the same thing that I would do if this were a maple and cut all of the crossing roots and kind of tried to clean up the nebari. And I'm going to also cut off the bottom of the root ball here to encourage more radial rooting. You don't really see good nebari in a lot of dwarf jade, but maybe that's because we're not going through these same steps that are needed in so many other bonsai species. So by cutting off all of the long roots that are kind of coming down here and making the plant sort of balance the use of the existing roots that are here, I might get more of these fine roots that are up here near the surface to kind of run out sideways, or if I don't, at least they'll get a little bit bigger and continue creating that nebari. Moving on up the tree, before I do any analysis of this trunk, I want to clean up a little bit of the growth here. And I know that in order to create more interest, I don't want to just allow long, straight shoots to go. So I'm going to go through and cut off a lot of these shoots, both to make it so that I have more interesting branches in the future and so that I can see the trunk as I go in and look and decide, okay, am I keeping these branches? Am I, going a completely different direction with this plant? So the first thing I'll do is just cut some of the shoots shorter and then also remove a bunch of the leaves so I can see the entirety of the structure. And because this is a jade and it's so kind of adaptable to this kind of work, I don't really have any concerns. I could take off 100% of the foliage and not have any sort of an issue. So I don't know for sure if I ever wired this. It looks like this portion may have been wired, but it's not 100% clear. In any case, what I'm seeing here is that a lot of the branching is just sort of too big, and there's not a lot of taper in what I have here so far. So rather than just keep all of this branching, I think I'm going to remove the majority of it and make the tree make smaller branching. Now, over time, this could increase the quality of the taper, but for now, it's just going to make the trunk look kind of weird. So a pretty severe kind of treatment here. I'm going to finish trimming the roots around the edge here and then go ahead and put this back into a growing container to go on and continue creating more character and interest. So I'll set this aside and let's take a look at another plant. All right, and this is in a 3-gallon grow bag and has been left to grow for probably about the last 12 months or so. I think I cut it back in early spring of last year. But this one actually started in a gallon can 2-3 years ago and was one of the first ones that I got from a commercial nursery where I just wanted to have a stock of dwarf jade to start making cuttings from. The interesting thing is that there is some variability in the bark, and the trees that came from that commercial nursery have a much rougher bark on average than some of the other ones that I have. There's sort of a continuum of them where you see some of them actually have completely smooth bark all the way to something like this, which is pretty quirky. Now, like I said, last year I cut this back pretty hard, and it was sort of interesting to see the results of what happened. But I think that after cutting it back hard like I did the other one just now that was in a gallon can, I let it grow out again. And so this is, I'm going to say, the next step essentially is that I've allowed the growth to go wild. So I'm going to do the same thing that I did just before to the gallon can one, I'm going to cut a lot of these shoots back. And if you want to make more trees, this is your opportunity to stick cuttings from all of these guys. They're pretty easy to root. All right, and now zoomed in, we can see a little bit of the character that the trunk has started to develop here. Now, part of it is that sort of corking that's happening on the bark here, but the other part is that there's some taper going from here to here. So I actually haven't removed the largest shoot at the top because I want to continue bulking this trunk, and so I'm going to treat that essentially like a sacrifice branch on a pine tree. Meanwhile, I've trimmed back a lot of the side shoots so that these branches don't get proportionally too big for the trunk, but in reality, I could just cut all of them off and start over again if I wanted to. But one of the things I'm thinking about here is that as this continues to get bigger up here, there may come a point where I actually want to cut off all of that and use one of these side branches as the rest of the trunk, or as the next section of the trunk. And I might come all the way back down to, say, this low side branch that already has some nice character to it. That would make a more compact and gnarly kind of composition than what I have in the older tree that I showed at the beginning of the video. So whether you are working with a tree that already has a good sized trunk and has had some development work put into it, or a younger tree, or somewhere in the middle, think about the shape of the trunk as the sort of center of your composition. If the trunk is not really interesting, then the composition is not really going to be interesting either, regardless of how pretty you make the branches. So take the time to build an interesting trunk, even if that means having a plant that doesn't look interesting in the interim. Since it's still early spring, I'm going to set these all back into the greenhouse for another month or so, and then they'll go out into the full sun. If you wanted to experiment with it, I'm sure that dwarf jade would grow much more quickly in the ground. I haven't tried it myself, but I am planning on doing so. That wraps up this video. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time.